Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Dard Newman. I'm the chair of the music department here at UC Santa Cruz. Before we begin, I want to share just a couple of details about the evening's event. It's being recorded and will be available as a YouTube link on the music department website in the coming week. We will send a follow-up email to each of you that contains the link as well as some other information about our program, including a place where you can make a donation in lieu of charging admissions tonight. Because tonight is a virtual premiere of a hi-fi audio recording, we would recommend that at this point, if you are able, to connect headphones or an external stereo or Bluetooth speakers to optimize your experience. In terms of the overall overview of the program, we're going to begin the program with a brief talk featuring Brian Baumbusch, the composer, Nat Berman, the conductor and ensemble leader, and two of our performers, Damien Stoffel and Jenny Crom. They're going to discuss how this project was conceived and assembled over the last 12 weeks. Then we're going to move to play a recorded version of the piece entitled Isotropes. The piece is approximately 25 minutes long. Then after the music, we're going to open things up for a question and answer session. Please use the Q&A tool at the bottom if you would like to submit questions throughout the event or after. These will not pop up for the audience to see, so don't feel like you're intruding on anything. But we will review them during and after the performance, and we'll issue them to the musicians afterwards. There are many people to thank for bringing this piece to life, and we will be displaying the names of the participants during the piece in lieu of having a program. So we're now going to begin with a panel discussion. As mentioned, the panelists are going to be myself, Nat Berman, Brian Baumbusch, Damien Stoffel, and Jenny Crom. But before I begin, I want to just share a little bit of a story. And the story begins soon before this quarter started, when this extraordinary circumstance that we're all living in first manifested itself in a degree where we all realized we were going to have to live in shelter and not be able to attend class in person. And the whole world was certainly in a scramble, and certainly our university was, and most definitely our department. Music is a very unique space where much has to happen in person. And in this context of confusion, anxiety, and despair, Brian reached out to me with an extraordinary email that, quite honestly, for me, shifted my whole orientation to how we're going to proceed. And I just want to share just a couple words from his email. It says, Dard, I'm writing this email because I've been thinking deeply about this predicament that ensembles have been having right now, as everything is shifting to remote learning for the next few months. Not an inspiration to compose a piece that is suited to this situation. Brian will speak about this. What's going to be unique about this is we're not working towards a real-time virtual, real-time live performance, but rather one that you're about to experience. And one of his rationales is he wanted to write a piece that would be more difficult to do live and in real time, which is, to put it really clearly, what Brian composed is something very unique, whereas many other ensembles are reimagining traditional pieces and performance fit to this unusual circumstance. What Brian was trying to do was use this moment to do something very new and uniquely catered to this moment. So I just wanted to share, this was the communication that Brian sent to me. And I have to be honest, it really inspired me as a chair to really think creatively and affirmatively about this very moment that we're in. So with that, I would just like to ask Brian, I mean, I kind of stole your thunder a little bit in terms of asking how this piece was conceived, but could you say a little bit more about both, not just the inspiration, but like how you were imagining this coming together?
Sure, thank you, Dard. Yeah, that was very well said on your part. One thing that I would add is I had the idea not because it was some new idea for me, but rather because I had already been making music using those performance practices. And in a way, it had been problematic for me in the past because I was writing music where the players were often in completely different tempi from one another. And the regular feedback was, oh, I wish I didn't have to hear all the people sitting around me. I could just focus on my click track. And so once the lockdown began to unfold and it became clear to me the situation many musicians were in, I kind of thought like, oh, this is my time. Like, this is what all of the musicians who have been learning my music for the past 5 years have been asking for. So might as well do something that is specifically catered to that experience.
That's extraordinary. Thank you. Matt, I'm curious if you could just say a few words about your role as a conductor and how that translated this quarter in these circumstances.
Yeah, sure. Well, so I did not conduct a single note of what was played this quarter. And that was, you know, at first when I realized that that was how it was going to be, as, you know, in that first kind of like crazy week when we were all working out what to do during COVID in terms of ensemble performance, you know, that was humbling and difficult to realize that the part of my craft that I value in some ways the most, which is like the kinetic connection to the players while they're playing and the guidance of rehearsals, all of that, just was not going to happen in the same way. But in a way, you know, I sort of still, you know, one of the roles of the conductor normally is, of course, to have like a really, have a knowledge of what works well in the score as it translates to instrumental practice and you know, instrumental idiom. And as Brian and I first started talking about the piece, you know, one of the ways that I think I was the most helpful in the early part of the process was just being able to sort of be in some ways like a translator or a connection to what works well for the ensemble, given that this was going to be a really unusual format for interacting with the score. You know, the students were going to be reading directly from individual parts, which I think we'll show a little bit how that worked in a moment. But just like being able to give some advice on instrumental ranges, breathing, all the things that are idiomatic to wind ensemble particularly, was my first kind of step into the project as a conductor in this circumstance. And then I think it just over the course of the class related more to after the initial stage where we were very deeply concerned with just figuring out how to describe to the players how to realize the piece. Then it had to do with sort of using the class time to do other things related to instrumental practice and using our time in other ways that weren't just related to Isotropes.
Wonderful, thank you. Oftentimes when one comes to a concert, one sees a finished expression behind which there's a lot of work that happens underneath the hood or inside the kitchen. And in this case, I actually want to try to lift the veil a little bit and ask Brian, like, can you just kind of take us behind the scenes and ask us how this piece was assembled? Like, you know, could you show a moment of the score and just give us a sense of, you know, how you interacted with Nat and the students to put this together asynchronously?
Sure. I just want to follow up on the word that you just used, because we had talked about the piece and you had used that word before. And I think it's an interesting word, but it's not a word I would use to describe this music, even though there's something comparable. But in a way, I think of the music as being like an evolved synchronicity, not to sound too pretentious, but this idea that, and what I mean, and what I'm about to show in the score is that what I was trying to accomplish, and the reason I had been making music for years using click tracks, was I'm very interested in these rhythmic structures where there will be multiple simultaneous tempos occurring, and often those tempos can be moving in different ways. And some of this comes as an influence from the music of Conlon Nancarrow, who wrote almost exclusively for player piano. And so he started to develop a language for creating rhythms that, quite frankly, couldn't be realized by anything other than a machine. And I've studied him a lot and got interested in thinking, how can I use computation and modern technology to assist musicians to do things that they couldn't otherwise do without the help of computation? So What I'm going to do now is share my screen and talk a little bit about how that works and how it was assembled in our case. So bear with me 1 second as I share the screen. So the first thing that you see here is the score to the piece. One aspect of the piece that is a little bit unusual is I consider it to be semi-open instrumentation, which is to say that it's not orchestrated for specific instruments, but it's orchestrated for instrument classes. So if you can see here on the left, the way what would normally be the instrument names in an orchestral score, I've given essentially ranges and qualities. So the quality in this case says sustaining, and all of these I'm calling the sustaining instruments. And then all of these are the non-sustaining instruments. So sustaining just means, could be wind, could be string, some instrument that can start a note and sustain it for as long as possible given breath or bow length or something like that. Non-sustaining would be what we would think of as traditionally percussion instruments, harp, things of that nature that have one attack and then decay based on the properties of the instrument. So this is kind of the outline that a normal orchestral score, especially a wind ensemble score, might look like. But I did it this way because, first of all, I initially thought that it might not just be the UCSC wind ensemble involved in this piece. So I didn't want to have it be specific to winds. So I thought that this section might contain winds and strings, for example. And also, we didn't know who was going to be involved when this project originally got confirmed. We didn't know what students had been enrolled, what instruments we were going to have. So it was sort of something I was forced to do to have sort of an adaptive approach to the score. So if you look carefully, you'll see in the beginning of the score, each instrument has an annotation. Maybe I can zoom in to make it a little more clear, where it says fragment 1. So the way the piece was assembled was I essentially wrote the piece and then split it into all of these different fragments so that the players could record them fragment by fragment rather than trying to record the whole piece at one time or a whole movement. So if you go to the second page of the score here, you'll see this is sustaining high 3, fragment 2 is this line I'm hovering over here. And now I'm going to show you what that part looks like. So this is the whole duration of that fragment. So the fragments tended to be anywhere from something as easy as a single note that lasts only a few seconds to something as difficult as a fast passage with no rest that lasts for over a minute. So there was a lot of variability in how the fragments unfolded in the structuring of the piece. But what was sort of most important was by fragmenting the piece in this way, I was able to go get very creative with this multi-tempo idea, because at any time I introduced a new fragment, it could all of a sudden be in a new tempo. And that didn't matter from the performer standpoint because they were just going to start playing from the beginning of the fragment anyways. So if you look here how this is organized, this is the bottom staff is a reference to the click track that they were going to hear, and each click track is specific to each fragment. So there was over 1,000 different click tracks in this project. And they would always get some preparatory beats to start. In other words, cue beats so that they would know when to enter at the right time. And then the click track would essentially guide them through what they were seeing. And anytime I used these empty note heads, that meant that I was in some different tempo. And then when I went back to regular note heads, it was in sort of the global tempo of the score. And then one last thing I'll say about how we directed it, and then I would love to hear from other people on the panel, is as we went along, to keep track of everything, everyone followed this spreadsheet, which the color coding was our way of delineating the fragments by difficulty. So the green squares were easy fragments, the yellow ones medium, and the orange ones difficult. And what the players would do was they would mark off their initials into a fragment that they planned to learn using lowercase initials, and then when they finished it, they would put their initials in uppercase. And so if you see, this is quite a big list. So it took all of the 10 weeks of the quarter to wrap up and conclude all of the fragments. So I'm going to leave the screen share now, and turn it over to someone else.
Wonderful. Thank you. I mean, and maybe with that in mind, I'd love to turn to our performers. Damien, how did this kind of changed environment of quarantine affect the process of practicing this music?
So it was like a lot more personal than before, because you don't really have the rehearsal aspect that you normally do with wind ensemble and classical music in general, where like you practice at home, then you go to rehearsal, and that's where really the music making happens, where you compare yourself to others. So it ends up making you even more of a perfectionist, because when you record yourself and listen back, like you hear every tiny little mistake, compared to like, you know, in a big group, it's easier to gloss over stuff. So it was like, I don't know, it was more intensely personal compared to being like a group thing. But then Brian's role is that he does that for us in the post-production by putting everything together and balancing everything out, so it still gets like a really good result.
Yeah, I can imagine, you know, many of us have the experience when we hear our voice echoed back to us. We're not always quite happy with what we hear. When we hear our musical voice, you're becoming attuned to that reflection and tuning yourself to it. So Jenny, kind of a similar question, but you know, what would you kind of reflect on some of the differences between recording fragments individually and playing a full piece in a real-time ensemble?
Well, I think in some ways there were a lot of similarities. You know, you're still sitting in a practice room, you know, with your metronome, trying to, you know, get something to a certain tempo that it's supposed to be, or, you know, get a certain color out of your instrument. I think that aspect of it was, you know, very similar to working in an ensemble. What was interesting for me was that this process, we were working with shorter increments of music, and sometimes out of chronology of the piece. So it kind of created this dislocated experience of practice. But from what I've been kind of learning through my own practice experiences, that it's actually really good to practice music this way, you know, in small chunks, and then put things back together into a larger context. And we always had that ability to look at the score and kind of see how things fit in. But in a way, what I liked about this project is that it was kind of like you could really just isolate what you were doing and sort of see what happens with it in real time, you know, as this sort of changing, living, breathing composition, you know, versus playing, you know, a Beethoven concerto or something like this. So.
Wonderful. So we're now going to shift to the actual performance itself, and just because we don't have liner notes, or maybe in a somewhat unusual circumstance, I just want to underscore that everyone here is a UC Santa Cruz student or graduate. Jenny is a master's student who actually just graduated. Damien is an undergraduate. Nat is a master's graduate at UC Santa Cruz, our conductor. And Brian, a year ago, got his doctorate here. So this is an all UCSC production and experience. And let us now, without further ado, move to the performance itself. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Nat Berman talking, and I wanted to just say as the first thing after hearing the piece, we would normally be in a concert hall applauding right now, and I know and recognize and appreciate that that's what you're doing in spirit right now. But I want to say a word of thanks to all the students and players who helped make this performance possible, and we can sort of applaud, as I say, in spirit as I do so. So for everybody who put in the work on this piece, and it was really unusual work, requiring a huge, I think, mental adjustment and musical adjustment. I would just want to say so many thanks to every member of the UCSC Wind Ensemble. And thanks so much to our faculty who joined us in this project very generously. Kyle Bruckman, Paul Contos, Richard Roper, Vanessa Rotolo, Willie Winant. We couldn't have done it without you and everybody who contributed. So great thanks to all of you and congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the rituals of our daily lives and our kind of professional habitations become manifest to us in times like this, when the things that were used to taking place don't happen. So the applause, I think we all feel it. And so just really congratulations to all of you. That was really lovely. We're going to move to a question and answer session. And you got 3 questions, Brian, that were really organized around kind of nomenclature. So what was the meaning of the name of the piece more broadly? And then, you know, if maybe you could explain the titles, how you came up with the titles to each part. And Charles asked whether the coronation section was the part where the virus spreads. So maybe if you could say a few words about your thoughts on nomenclature.
Sure. So I don't always have imagery that I associate with music, but in this case, there were certain things that kept popping into my head. Of course, right when it started, the lockdown had just settled in, so you know, I was a little bit, I think, scared like everyone else, and unsure of the future and how I was supposed to handle going out into the world and interact with the world. So I was thinking a lot about the virus when I wrote the first part, but I did very much write the piece sequentially because of how we had to learn it. Like I could only write a little bit and then release it to the students, and then as they were recording it, I would run off and write the next bit and then send that to them. So I think I kind of thought about different things throughout, but the initial title, I think I just came up with right away. The word just popped into my head, and I knew it means things that are measure the same distance when going in different directions. And I thought it was a unique play on words with the fact that we were all in isolation, but it was also telling of the process in that I was having to create these very precise little time cues, and then I would have to send them off through the ether, and then people would use those time cues to create music and then send it back to me, and hopefully they would all measure the same each way, and that way I could assemble the piece. So that's where the initial title came from. Then the various subtitles for the parts, I put names to them more recently. One of the more important images for me with this whole piece, and a lot of music that I'm striving for in writing music like this, is the idea of the murmuration of starlings, of birds, which is, if you don't know what I'm talking to, that's the photo that we showed on the welcome screen and right at the beginning of the piece, of a flock of birds that move in this uncanny unison together. And for me, there's an aspect of when music is happening in multiple simultaneous tempos that are all weaving in and out of each other, it has that sort of effect where you feel and hear them moving together, but you can't really tell quite how it's happening and when it's going to take a different direction. So that was definitely a big image for me. And then I was thinking a lot about the heart and anxiety. And so that's where the escalation, of course, murmuration works both ways. Coronation, a little bit of a play on words with coronavirus, but it really means crowning. But the root of it comes from the core, which is heart. And to me, it has a little bit of a violent connotation. And of course, everything that's happened over the last few weeks has been really, really hard to live through. And hopefully we can find some reconciliation. So that's why I put all those names there.
Thank you. A couple questions about, kind of related. What takeaways did this experience give you? And I thought that maybe, you know, Jenny and Damien, if you wouldn't mind kind of thinking about the experience and takeaways from this project in a post-COVID or still COVID, post-pandemic world, as you think about from the world we're in to the potential future world we might eventually get to.
Yeah, absolutely. I can start out with that. So I guess, you know, the big question that, you know, kept coming up for myself and for, you know, the other, my other classmates was, you know, how are we going to keep doing what we love to do? You know, how are we going to keep making music? And I think the positive takeaway from this project for me has been that, you know, we're always going to be able to make music somehow. You know, if we have someone who's creative and innovative to think of like new ways to make music. And I think the, you know, the process of working with new music and contemporary music with a living composer for me was a really special experience. So I'm going to keep, you know, looking for those kinds of experiences, because this is really 2020 music. You know, this couldn't have been made even a year ago, I don't think. So I'm excited that, you know, I got to be a part of 2020 music, and I want to do more of it. So that's a takeaway for me.
Thank you.
I agree with Jenny about how it was really cool to work with a composer directly in performing, because usually, like, you know, I know only what I can read on Wikipedia about the composer or like listen to recordings of their music, but it's very different working directly with one. And part of what I learned like by doing music this way was about how music is special to me, or like classical music in particular too, is special because it's such a large group of people all working together to make something work. And it works here as well as like in-person music, but it's like I think having that part be like significantly changed made it more obvious how like that's what's really important about music to me, is how everyone plays together instead of individually.
Thank you. Nat, this is a question that actually is for Brian and for Nat differently, but what were some of the challenges you encountered, Brian, when creating this piece, and Nat, and kind of overseeing it and bringing it together in the way that you did? I know you addressed that somewhat already, but I think there were a few questions about the challenges that you encountered.
Yeah, I mean, there were many. This is a totally new endeavor, well, in most respects anyway. So I think I did mention about how Brian and I were in touch about kind of like translating some of his ideas to make them the most workable for wind players and percussionists, but Brian is a percussionist. I mean, I think that side of it he knows very well. And so for wind players, there were things like dealing with breathing issues that could be a little bit of a struggle, and we worked out a system for that. But I think even more, it's just it was an intangible thing. I mean, we haven't really even talked about this, but it was making the transition into a video-only interface for an ensemble that actually has a culture of being, like Damien said, being together, working together, feeling each other's energy and feeding off of it. And I don't know that I took on that challenge head on in any way that I let the ensemble know, but I think it was about kind of trying to maintain some of the the aspects of our interaction that would happen in a real rehearsal, like keeping our culture alive, trying to allow for the personality of students to still be present in what was happening. And that was hard because we had a lot of logistics to deal with. But I would say for me personally, that was one of the biggest challenges. There were far many other technical challenges that Brian had to deal with, and the students had to deal with regard to the actual recording, which we haven't even discussed kind of their process at home of how they did it. But that was one of the ones that I found the most difficult.
Brian, you want to talk about some of the challenges in creating and maybe processing this piece?
Yeah, I mean, the number one thing that comes to mind is just how labor intensive it was for me, because there were so many different sides to it. But that was great for me because it was a labor of love, and it was in a time when I felt like the thing that I should be doing is being away from people. And that's what I was doing the whole time I worked on this. Another big challenge was really the emotional side of it. I had never been in a situation where I, on the one hand, had to write a piece while people were still learning it. I always had the experience where I could take as much time as I needed to finish a piece, and then when I felt like it was fully ready, release it. But in this case, that I couldn't do that. Ultimately, I think it made the music all the more powerful because I had that pressure, and I felt like it mattered what I did in the moment. But there was a lot of really terrible things that have happened during the time that I've written this piece. So there was a lot for me to deal with emotionally, what it meant for me to be making music at that time, what type of music should be put out in the world right now, things like that.
Absolutely. One observation and one perhaps final question. Charles, if you don't mind, I'm going to, thanks for joining us, read your question or your comment. Remarkable how different this sounds from a symphonic wind ensemble playing live in a concert hall. Almost like a synthesized band. Brian Baumbusch has achieved a very interesting play of timbres here. And then a question that's kind of related, but a question came. The breath sounds were very interesting. Can you tell us about the motivation, inspiration behind them?
Yeah, I'm not sure if everyone can, I typed an answer to that, and I'm not sure if all of the attendees can see, but I'll paraphrase in any case, which was, it was kind of like the title of the piece. It just sort of popped into my head, the idea of breath sounds, as something that I could do, like that would be easy and possible to do, and quiet, that people could just record their breathing through the instrument at any time and not bother their parents or their neighbors or whoever. And then once I started putting that together, I had the experience of listening to that while in a safe way, wearing a mask, and everyone around me was wearing a mask. And that was a powerful experience for me. And then of course, George Floyd was suffocated, and the whole thing became just terrifying for me. And I think that gave me some motivation to write the type of things I did in the last two parts of the piece.
Absolutely. And I want to address our last question to Jenny and Damien. What did this music mean to you as a performer? Maybe Jenny, start with you, and then Damien will bring us home.
Yeah, I'm just honestly, I'm just really grateful that I got to make music at all this quarter with you know, this group of people that I've gotten to work with for the last 2 years, but also getting to work with a new composer with Brian. His just sheer drive to make this happen was really inspiring for me, and you know, and the music I'm going to be trying to create in the future. And I just think, you know, pandemic music doesn't have to be, you know, something that, you know, was written, you know, 100 years ago. Pandemic music can be something that is using the circumstances that we have now in a way that is really unique and, you know, really taking advantage in a way of a terrible situation, making the best out of it. So it was a real you know, privilege, I think, to be a part of something like this on such a large scale. If you see just the sheer number of recordings that everyone submitted, and you know, and just the number of fragments that Brian had to navigate, it's really it's pretty amazing. So I'm grateful that I could kind of do my part, you know, just playing, you know, my little like 30-second thing, and have it turn into this massive, you know, blossoming 25-minute piece. So it was a great experience.
Thank you. Damien?
For me, it was the greatest part that I took away was that I was able to be part of something bigger, even in this time when everything's completely atomized. Like everyone has to stay a certain distance from everyone else. We're all wearing masks. Like we're all holed up in our own homes, but we were able to still like make it work and produce something collective instead of, you know, just like going inward and collapsing into ourselves. Like at least I was still able to be part of something bigger this quarter.
Well, I think that's such a beautiful and profound observation, and perhaps a very fitting way to bring our evening to a close. So thank you, Damien, for that, you know, I mean, very thoughtful observation. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us in this, you know, very unique circumstance of, as Damien just said, kind of isolated unity. There'll be a chat where you can, if you like, consider donating to the UCSC Music Department or the Wind Ensemble. Again, thank you very much. Thanks to our performers and composers, and I wish you a good night. Thank you.